So now we're going to go over our sensors, and in this segment we're going to be talking about the installation of the Decap sense. And so what you'll need is, when you find in your box, you're going to have the sensor itself, you're going to have the mounting hardware, which we give you additional. You can reuse the original screws if you'd like. You're going to have the Decap hose, you're going to need a case that has a spent primer and a 9/64 Allen key. So the first step is to remove the fixed mount Decap. So we'll go ahead and do that now. Now with this removed, we're able to install our new Decap sensor. And so we're going to install it in the same fashion that we removed the fixed mount. Okay. Now that that's tight, we're going to take our cable and we're going to plug it into station number 5. Now this will apply for the Evolution or Revolution, as well as the Apex 10. The same theory applies to the other platforms as well, including the 650 and 1050, but you will use your user manual to verify that you're in the correct port. Now once this is installed, this particular sensor requires that we power down and power it back on. So we'll do that now. Now while we're waiting for our tablet to fully boot back up, we're going to install our hose. And be sure that this is routed into a closed container or box or jug, just to avoid breathing in any contaminants. And so now we can calibrate. Okay, and so now to check functionality, we're going to go right to our sensor menu. And we're going to enable our Decap sense. And without putting this in first, we're going to hit run. Now you'll notice that it stopped halfway up the stroke and it says no ejected primer detected. We'll hit end cycle. And now let's check our work. We'll put a case in with a spent primer and we'll perform the same function. And now it should stop on this upstroke. Perfect. No ejected primer. We'll disable the sensor. We'll end cycle and we'll remove this case. So now we know our sensor is functioning correctly. Now there is a bit of maintenance that you will do. This will eventually get dirty. Inside of the optical sensor is a small piece of glass. You will get a prompt on the screen that'll alert you that it is having trouble viewing and it's time to clean it. And so when you do get that message, you're going to take a Q-tip with some isopropyl alcohol and you're going to go up inside of there and you're just going to do a good cleaning and then go back to normal function. So the next sensor in this segment we're going to talk about is the Swage sense. And so to get started on this, you're going to find in the box the instructions, the sensor itself, which will include a large and a small upper Swage rod. We're going to need a 5/16 and a half-inch Allen, or you can use an adjustable wrench, as well as a 3/32 Allen to remove the cover and to adjust our sensor. And so we'll begin by removing the cover plate with our 3/32. Okay, we'll place the cover to the side. And next we want to reach behind so we can remove the eccentric bolt and turn and remove. So now with that out of the way, we can install our Swage sense and then guide it in. And in certain cases, you may have to put the rod deeper into the sensor to allow enough clearance. And now we'll reinstall our cam eccentric, line it back up, and reinsert our pin. Now we can reinstall the cover. Okay, so once that's tight, we are going to install this We're going to plug it into port number 1. We're going to route it right through the middle. Pull the excess and plug into port number 1. Now, we've already set our hold down die in a previous video. Make sure that is done before setting our Swage sense. We're going to again use a new case, or you can purchase a cutaway, and we're going to do a setup, move to bottom. At this point, we can raise our Swage rod until we're fully seated in the hole. Once I feel resistance on my new case, I stop and I will lock it in place there. We can make further adjustments if necessary if we're running into a lot of military crimped cases that require additional swaging. And so now we want to adjust the sensitivity. And by doing so, you can hear on, off, on, off. I want to get it close to the off switch as I can, and so as to give it the most sensitivity. And so now with that being set, my Swage is ready to go. I'm going to hit end cycle. Now the first thing we're going to do is go to our sensor menu, and we're going to enable it on the tablet. Make sure I'm at a slow rate of speed, and I will simulate what's going to happen in the case of a ringer detected. So we're going to hit run. Now you'll notice on the screen it says ringer detected. It gives me two options. I have OK or clear case. And so it sensed an obstruction in my primer pocket. I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to use my jog features to jog slightly up to remove that case. Once I've removed that case, found the obstruction, I can continue on by hitting end cycle. It will complete the stroke so that all of the other functions of the toolhead are performed. And now we'll move on. All right, in this next segment, we're going to go over the installation and setup of the primer orientation sensor. And so what you're going to start out with is the sensor itself. We've got the probe, the two springs, and an additional hardware and spring kit that we supply with the sensor itself. What we want to do before we even start our installation is a couple of preps. And so we're going to take our springs and we're going to put a very light coat of grease on them, just like so, as well as the probe. Now what I like to do as well in advance is put a couple drops of oil on the sensor and then work that in, just like so. Help it function right away. And so now the first thing we have to do, if you'll notice, our block off plate is underneath our shell plate, and so we'll need to remove the tool head as well as the shell plate to gain access for the installation. For more information, please refer to the shell plate or maintenance videos that will go in depth onto the removal and replacement of that. All right, now that we have our springs and probe installed, we can insert our sensor by routing the cable through the opening, ensuring that we're going straight up and down. We're going to line the probe up with the sensor, hold it in place while we insert the two bolts with our 9/16 Allen, like so. Now that our springs and probe is installed, we're going to route our cable through the opening like so, and we're going to insert our sensor straight down onto the probe and springs, holding it in place, and we will insert the two bolts that retain it using our 9/64 Allen to tighten it down. Now that the bolts are installed and tightened down, we're going to take our cable and route it around the outside of the console, and we're going to bring it back and plug it into port number 2. We can now reinstall our shell plate and tool head and move on to the next step of setting it up. All right, now that we've got the tool head and shell plate reinstalled, we want to make sure before we move forward that our shell plate is indexed properly by verifying that the ramp is right in the center of the opening pocket of the shell plate. If you need to make an indexing adjustment, please refer to our indexing adjustment videos. The next step is we're going to set the sensor height, and so to do that we're going to take a properly primed piece of brass and we're going to insert it into the station. At this point we can take a look at our pin, and we will want to access the two screws on the back with a 3/32 Allen. our initial goal is to set this flush. So we're going to loosen these two screws. We're going to adjust the height of the sensor so it lines up flush with the pin, and we will tighten it down. What we'd want to do first is remove this and perform a calibration. This enables the sensor to read itself correctly and function. So now we can test it immediately with no piece of brass by enabling the prime orientation sensor on the tablet and pressing run. The press should immediately give you a notification saying case not present or primer not seated properly. We'll press OK. Now we will insert our properly primed piece of brass, which should be flush with the sensor, and press run. Now it allowed that to pass by and stopped immediately with a notification telling me no case or primer seated properly present. So now we're going to check our work by using an upside down primer and inserting it into the same location. We want to make sure that it does not allow this to go by. So we're going to press run. And immediately we get a notification. Now if it did allow this to go by, that would tell us that we need to raise or lower the sensor slightly by a millimeter or so and retest to make sure that we have it exactly where it needs to be. Again, what's most important when setting this is making sure that the shell plate is indexing properly so that this is properly lined up. The other thing that you'll want to do is occasionally put a drop of oil on the ramp and probe and cycle the press so that it can work itself in. Keeping your prime orientation sensor maintained is key to its good performance. All right, the next segment we're going to cover the installation and setup of the bullet sense. And so we're going to go ahead and open this package and show you its contents. Inside you will find the instructions, installation tips. We will have the mirror assembly, our laser and bullet head sense assembly, as well as the hardware to mount it. So let's go ahead and start by removing the head assembly. And right away I will remove this. Okay. Now we're going to go into our hardware, and you'll find that there is a spacer block. There are two bolts that are short to hold the platform in place, and then you've got two options as far as mounting the mirror assembly. Now the shorter one would be used without the spacer block and the longer with. I prefer to use the spacer block as it gives me more adjustability. So we'll put that back in the bag. And one of the things I like to do right away is ensure that both rods are seated fully. And so to do so, I will go ahead and take an adjustable wrench and just give those a little tug to check. Just being sure. Once we have this all in place, we want to make sure that it doesn't move. And so we'll go ahead and undo the cabling. Get that ready, as well as your mirror assembly will likely have a thin plastic cover to protect the mirror. We'll go ahead and remove that. And now we can begin by installing our platform with the two short bolts on the left side of the K-Speed platform using a 3/16 Allen wrench. So now we're going to go ahead and fully tighten these. And we can take our head assembly along with our spacer, set that right in place, and drop this right back in. We can go ahead and take the cable assembly and plug it into port number 3 at this time. We should see our laser come on right away. Excellent. So this next step is going to require a flared piece of brass, which I will insert into station number 9 and place the projectile right on top. I'm going to lower the laser and adjust the head left to right until it lines up centered on the projectile. At that point, I will go from underneath the bullet sense head. I'll tighten my 1 thumb screw and the Allen with a 9/64. Now this left to right setting should be locked in place, and I can raise this mirror above the projectile, and I'm ready to install my mirror. So from this side, I'll take my longer bolt and I will put it through the back of the mirror assembly, and now I will use my spacer and I will have that staged and ready to go while I remove the existing bolt from the back of the machine. So if you're looking from the right side of the machine angle, it's going to be the bolt on the left-hand side. We will remove that bolt, place to the side, and insert our mirror assembly. So you'll notice that the assembly allows movement left to right. At this time, I will kind of push it all the way to the left, in this case with 9mm is the most common, and then we'll fully tighten this down for now. The next step is using my 5/64, and we'll just swing this out of the way. I'm going to access the 2 small screws holding the mirror assembly so I can rotate it as needed. So now, using my mirror and looking at this angle, I can adjust my laser to point back at the bullet. The goal is to have the laser go over the top of the projectile, bounce off the mirror, and back into the optical sensor on the laser head. So for now, I will remove the case and projectile so I have a good view. Okay. So now I am going to adjust this mirror left and right until I can get it as closely lined up to that optical sensor as possible, and then I will snug this 2 screws back down using my 5/64 Allen. Now we'll take our 1/16 Allen and go to the very top of the bullet sense head. At a 45-degree angle, you will see that there's Allen screws. By turning these back and forth and watching that laser, they create an X pattern. So what I want to do is use these to adjust and make this go right back up into the sensor hole so that the laser sees itself. We'll most likely have to do this adjustment a couple times because as we raise and look, we'll be required to adjust it again. So now we're in the hole. We're going to place our flared case with projectile back in location, and what we're looking for is to cast a nice shadow over top of it, allowing it to proceed. But we're going to check our work, and we're going to take the projectile and put it upside down. We want to make sure that it doesn't block the view or cast a shadow so that the machine will stop when needed at that point. So now that this is lined up, I will go ahead and tighten everything down so that it does not move. So in this, I would use a pair of pliers on the brass thumb wheels, which are 2 on the height adjustment and 1 underneath the head. By doing this, it will ensure that it stays in place much longer if you accidentally bump into it while doing maintenance on your machine. Now, I always want to double check and make sure that the laser is lined up the best it can be in the hole. I'll remove my case and I'll press calibrate. Ensure everything is free and clear at this point. Make sure you have a good calibration. And I will immediately go to my sensor menu and enable the bullet sense and press run. The machine did not proceed and it says bullet not properly positioned. Now let's go ahead and check our work. I'm going to place my flared case and my projectile back in the proper location with the sensor enabled. And I will press run. It should allow it to proceed and stop at the next station. Exactly as it performed, bullet not positioned properly because there's no case present. That is a successful setup of the bullet sense. All right, now that we've got our revolution completely set up, we've got our dies initially set, we've got all of our sensors put in place, now we can begin an actual live loading session. So let's start with adding our components. The brass that I'm using is processed, and the way I do that is I use a separate tool head. I perform 3 operations. One is to decap it, the second is to hold down and swage it, and the third is to size it. I clean it before and after, so it is ready to go. You can alleviate a lot of your problems by using good components. And I always like to say that a report is only as good as the data you use. Your loaded cartridge is only as good as the components you're using. So we'll insert this. And we've got our bullets. In this case, it's going to be 124 grain extreme plated bullets. We're using CCI primers in the bowl, and we're going to go ahead and activate our powder measure. So before we do that, we make sure the plunger is in the up position. And again, if this was not in the up position, I would take a case and hold it underneath the funnel while I raise it so I don't spill powder. I'm going to make sure that I'm on 3-stage because I'm loading 9mm, and we'll go ahead and power that on. Okay, and now I'll go ahead and power on my primer vibratory controller. And as our primers make their way, I always make sure when I look down, just in case, occasionally you will have a primer that comes down sideways right from the ramp, and we want to go ahead and correct that. And to do so, you would just use a small object like a pick or such, and you would reach in and correct that if that were the case. Okay, now we'll put this to the side. Now, what I like to do before any reloading session is I want to do what's called a wiggle test. And so I'm going to check everything before I start a session and just make sure nothing came loose, nothing looks out of place, check my pins, and so forth, just to avoid any stoppages that I could have found in the beginning. So now, before I even load one round, I'm going to begin by verifying and checking my sensors. And so I'll go right to my sensor menu, and I'm going to enable a couple of important ones right off the bat. Now, the bullet sense, if it's set up properly, will not allow the press to move. So I'll enable it and I'll press run. You'll see immediately that I have an error message. That's good. Now I know before I even start loading that my bullet sense is working correctly. Now I'm going to go to my prime orientation sensor. And again, I'm going to just press run. Perfect. It says case not present, primer not seated. So now I know that that sensor is set up properly. And I can continue this on and on. So testing the powder sense. Hit run. It stops and gives me a case powder level incorrect, so now I know that my powder sense is working. A decap, I already have decap brass, but let's test it. And so you see it stops and gives me the error message, no ejected primer detected. What I've effectively done is I've tested all my sensors before I've even started loading, and this is something I encourage everyone to do so you don't find out in the middle of your session. So now we'll go ahead and start our brass. One thing that you may have to do is ensure that it stops by adjusting this as soon as the brass reaches this point. Okay, now no adjustment is required, but if it was, I would simply slide this in and out to adjust the micro switch to shut off as soon as it reaches this point. So now on our control menu, you can start off slow. We've got our digital clutch at a setting of 3, which is the lower of the pistol settings that I use. And we're going to go ahead and put on our safety glasses now that we're live loading. And so I'm going to start at 2000. What I'm going to do is go ahead and let it get to the prime orientation sensor, and then I will go ahead and activate that sensor for you. So there's a couple ways to do this. When you get more comfortable, you can do that on the fly. You don't need to stop the machine to do so, but we'll proceed on and you'll see. I'm going to go right to my sensor menu. Now I'm going to hit end cycle now so that it stops over the sensor and I can activate the sensor. Now I'll do the same thing for the powder sec and the bullet sense. Now I'll activate my powder sense. And again, now I will activate my bullet sense. So all of my sensors are now active at this time. We're going to start checking immediately our overall lengths, our powder check, our crimp, and make the proper adjustments before we make too many rounds. I kind of have a rule of thumb that I'd like to check everything in 3s, so that's how we'll do it. So the first thing we'll do is check our overall length, and I'll make the necessary adjustments immediately. So I'm at 1.144, 1.141, and 1.140. So I'm looking to be around 1135. So I'm going to bring it down about 5 thousandths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to take these same rounds and put them in my case gauge and see if I need to make an immediate adjustment on my crimp. So I do have one round that's a little thick, and that could be the first round that came out. So before I make an immediate adjustment, we're going to go ahead, we'll take one more, let it out, and this one is not going to have my overall length adjustment, so we'll take the next 3. Oops. 2. And that was 4 because I dropped 1, but we'll check these right away in my case gauge. Take a close look at our primer depths. Everything looks good there. Now let's go ahead and measure. So I'm at 1137, 1136, and 1136. So I'm going to go ahead and move it 2 thousandths. We know our crimp's good, we know our primer seating depth is good, and my overall length is going to be good. I want to focus back on the powder measurement at this time, so I'm going to go ahead and take the case underneath the bullet dropper and put it on my scale and give it away. Okay. Now my first reading is 3.9, and that could be because the powder is settling. So let's go ahead and take another, and we'll check that. Again, I have 3.9, and I have a good feeling that the third one is going to be the same. So I'm going to go ahead and make an adjustment necessary on my powder check. So here on my powder measure, loosen the jam nut, bring the plunger in just slightly, lock it down, and let's go ahead and take a few more runs. So again, I want to thoroughly check everything. So let's keep our eye on the overall lengths. 1.135, 1.137, 1.137. So we're still a little more, and I can adjust that easily. Checking our case gauging is good, and our primer depths are good. So now let's go back to our powder, see if our adjustment. And we were able to bring that back to about 3.7, which is I'm okay with 3.7, 3.8. This particular load is made for competition, not for your everyday target practice. 3.8. And let's check one more as a rule of 3. And 3.8. So my powder level is good at this time. Let's go ahead and make a run. At this point, with all my sensors active, I could bring the speed up. So I'm constantly checking as I load. 1133, 1132, 1132. Okay, 1, 2, 3. In the beginning of our session, we want to constantly stay on top of this to make sure if any adjustments are needed, we perform those adjustments before we make too many bad rounds. So once we're all settled, we can take these, I like to call them setup or practice rounds, and I know that every round coming here forward is going to meet my specifications. So let's take a look at some different things at this point. We've got a correct orientation on our primers. If we need to make adjustments on that, it's very simple to do at this point. And the goal is to maintain around 300 to 100 primers. If we have not enough primers in the bowl, they're going to run a little faster and there's potential for getting upside downs. We'll go ahead and show you in some other videos in troubleshooting how to correct some of these things if you do get some mistakes.